when I was initially diagnosed, I think my longer term goal was how was I going to get back on the field? And I think having that external goal that was aside from my pure health actually helped me throughout the process. When I'm on the field, I'm not really thinking about how things used to be. Honestly, something that I've kept in mind throughout is just how fortunate I am to actually be on the field and competing. You essentially receive a new immune system. So all of my blood currently is actually donor blood.
And what were maybe some of your bigger takeaways as someone who very intimately interacted with the healthcare system and then going and actually working in it from a finance perspective?
Yeah, it's definitely unique to see it from the other angle. And I'd say that there's a lot of things that you might not expect or understand from the patient's angle. For example, it's a pretty interesting conversation, especially in health services, where the incentives sometimes aren't as closely aligned as you might expect.
Welcome to The Stroll Season 1. I'm your host, Sam Thompson. In this season, I'll work to engage in conversations that dive deep into the intricacies of each guest's unique career, while also bringing to light the reality of how each guest maintains their health and the professional culture they work in. In this episode, I'm fortunate enough to sit down and speak with Evan Lasseter. Evan is a bit younger than the typical guest on The Stroll. He's a rising sophomore at Wesleyan, majoring in economics and psychology. Before Wesleyan, Evan was a dedicated student athlete in high school, playing both lacrosse and football. After high school, Evan decided to take a post-grad year to work towards being a recruited college athlete. And during his PG year, Evan was diagnosed with leukemia. He went on to defer his enrollment at Wesleyan to pursue treatment, starting with 6 months of chemotherapy. Sadly, Evan didn't respond favorably to his chemotherapy, a course of treatment that is successful for approximately 95% of patients in his situation. After pivoting his course of treatment to immunotherapy and thereafter a bone marrow and stem cell transplant, Evan achieved full remission. All throughout his journey, Evan trained to return to the football field. Evan matriculated into Wesleyan in 2023. That year, as a safety for the football team, he didn't miss a single practice. This past season, Evan saw in-game action on the special teams unit, and the Wesleyan football team went on to win the NESCAC. Outside of athletics and academics, Evan also volunteers at the National Marrow Donor Program, helping patients going through the same transplant treatment he received. This summer, Evan will be interning at Northwell Health as a financial operations summer analyst, and he has accepted an offer to work at PJT Partners as an investment banking summer analyst during his junior year summer. Before jumping into today's episode, I'd like to briefly mention our charity partner, Sochabe, a federally recognized and registered 501c3 nonprofit organization. Sochabe is a grassroots charity organization that recently built Seminole Academy outside of Mbala, Zambia. For those who don't know, Zambia is a country in southern Africa. Sochabe was founded by my lifelong friend, Teza Seminole, who named the Seminole Academy after his father. Teza is a lifelong tennis player and was ATP and ITF ranked in his heyday and was a member of the Zambian Davis Cup team. He started Sochabe over a decade ago and went on to build Seminole Academy to give the children in his home village the opportunity to attend school. Sochabe emphasizes academics while also providing students with the opportunity to play sports outside of school. If you'd like to donate to Sochabe, the PayPal donation link can be found at sochabe.com. That's SOCHABE.com. I'd like to highlight that Sochabe operates with virtually no overhead. Every single penny that is donated ends up directly funding education, school maintenance and development, and equipment. When Teza travels to Zambia to visit the school, he pays for his flights out of his own pocket. Once again, you can donate at sochabe.com, that's SOCHABE.com, to support Seminole Academy and Teza's goal of bringing education to the children of his home village. Thank you. Thank you for sticking around. Now for my conversation with Evan. So I don't think that there's anybody better suited to tell your story than yourself. So why don't, in whichever way you see fit, kind of introduce your story to the audience?
Yeah, happy to. So to introduce myself, I'm Evan Lasseter, and first of all, really appreciate you having me on. Definitely exciting opportunity. And for me, I'm from Westchester, New York, so not too far from here. And was a pretty passionate student athlete in high school. So I think Wesleyan made sense for me, where I could continue my football career and get a little bit more of an interdisciplinary liberal arts education. So I was excited about that. And for me, had a pretty unique experience where prior to getting to Wesleyan was actually diagnosed with leukemia. and that was in the spring of my postgraduate year. Definitely really challenging and really unique experience, obviously, but really, really fortunate to be in a position where I have my full health and have had a pretty complete remission here for about 2 years. And I've been able to go back to Wesleyan and continue my football career as I'd intended and really enjoyed the experience there. So definitely excited to talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And you're a little bit younger than the typical guest I'll have on the podcast. The typical guest is anywhere from 1 to 3 years out of college, but I think your story is a very powerful one. So I'm very thankful to have you here to share it. And in thinking about kind of the transition from high school, then your PG year into college, what would you say your high school experience was like as a dedicated student athlete? I know you played a few sports in high school. And then how did your high school experiences kind of inform the way you approached in your PG year and the end of your high school experience getting diagnosed with leukemia?
I think for me, really enjoyed football and knew that it was something that I would want to pursue in college, really when COVID hit. So I actually wasn't planning on pursuing it in college, and I was going to go to school to be a normal student. And my senior year, I had actually applied to a number of schools to do so. And then my senior football season was canceled in the fall because of the COVID situation. And then from there, realized that I really loved football and wanted to continue pursuing it. It was always something that I felt helped me better myself as a person. And in addition to being on the field with your brothers is really a rewarding experience. So I think having that experience where I lost football for a little bit and realized what my life would be without it allowed me to realize that it'd be something I want to pursue in college. So having not had the season in the fall that we would have had, it was in my best interest to take a postgraduate year, and was able to do that at Proctor Academy, which was a good experience, and really enjoyed the football team there as a post-grad, and was also able to play lacrosse, which I had done in high school as well, and was excited to get the opportunity at Wesleyan, where I'm currently really enjoying the football program as well.
One of my past podcast episode guests in episode 4 mentioned that you really sometimes need something to be taken away for you to realize how much you love it. And it seems like, if I'm getting the timeline right, COVID hit or because of the COVID situation in the fall of your senior year, you weren't able to play your senior year of football.
Right.
And then you took a PG year, but also in that time you were diagnosed with leukemia. So what was your mentality in terms of actually being able to play football in that PG year after your diagnosis?
Yeah, for sure. And to clarify a little bit, I played my senior year actually in the spring after COVID, and we had a delayed season, but definitely didn't get the full experience.
Got it.
And then knew that I wanted to take the postgraduate year to incur some more opportunities at the college level with football, and then actually was able to play that season with my full health, and I actually ended up getting diagnosed in the spring of my postgraduate year, so was able to play the postgraduate year in my full health, which was awesome experience. And interestingly enough, I was actually in the middle of my lacrosse season when I got my diagnosis, and it's a pretty interesting story, to your point, where had another instance of not being able to play football for another year, and I think that's had a similar impact in terms of really allowing me to appreciate the opportunity.
And so did you have a year in between your PG year and college where you were just focused on regaining your health?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good question. So I was diagnosed in the spring, and from there it became pretty apparent that the most standard route for me would have been 8 or 9 months of chemotherapy. So I had talked with my family and my coach, who's been extremely supportive, about the next steps, and it became clear that the best move was going to be to defer the year and really just have that year to focus on my treatment so that I could come in, as I was really fortunate to be able to do so, my freshman year in my full health.
And so in that year of treatment, was that year solely focused to receiving your chemotherapy and then any other treatments you may have pursued? And then what were you doing that year to also, I would say, pursue the things in life that you enjoyed? Because I'm sure, I would imagine that you wouldn't just want to be receiving treatment and maybe sleeping and relaxing, that you probably, as someone who's very active and loves sports, also wanted to remain active during that time.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. And you're exactly right, where I think the treatment was definitely intense and took a lot of my time, and definitely wasn't in my best physical health at the time. I think on multiple occasions, I actually lost all the muscle mass that I had gained previously and had to work back from that. But in order to keep myself busy, definitely did a number of things. I started reading a lot more, which was, I think, definitely helpful as far as once I got to the classroom, I was able to have that next step and also a little bit more of an intellectual curiosity that I might not have had previously. But other things I did to keep in touch with people that I knew and also just be involved was I actually ended up coaching my high school football team that I had played for. So in that year off, I volunteered and helped coach the linebackers that were at Somers High School at the time, which was pretty rewarding and definitely made better by the fact that the team was really good. They actually went undefeated and won the state championship.
Wow.
So couldn't have gone much better with them. But I think they enjoyed my presence in the sense that I would get them fired up at the right time. So that was my value add there. And I also took up some graphic design in that time as well and started to make their graphics for their game day posts or their final scores or whatever it is, and was able to help them with that as well as my Proctor, which was my other former team at the time, and make those for them. So was able to stay a little bit intellectually engaged in that process and also see the football guys, which was awesome.
It sounds wonderful also to have that community around you that you were a part of in your own high school football career, and then to be able to go back and contribute to it. Did you ever win a state championship when you were on the field in high school or no?
Yeah, it's a good question. We hadn't won it, so it had eluded us.
That was the first ever.
Yeah, it was their first since 2016, but it was their second as a school.
Okay.
Which was pretty sweet. And for us, my senior year, we played again in the spring season after COVID. So we had a shortened 6-game season where there was no state playoffs. And we actually went undefeated and we won our section, so to speak. But we didn't have that opportunity to go to the state playoffs. And we had always thought that we would have made a run in the state championship. So it was nice to be with those guys and see them actually do that. And I ended up getting the ring one way or another. So that was interesting.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I don't personally have a ring. I remember my sport where I had the best potential opportunity to do that would have been in high school tennis, not in the individual events where you're only your singles team or the doubles team, but as the team, when you have 3 singles players and 4 doubles teams. But we only had the state playoff available in our senior year. It started in my senior year. I had no COVID hindrance in my high school career, but freshman, sophomore, and junior year, we didn't have that even ability to go to states as a team.
Okay.
So sadly, don't have a ring myself, but I mean, do you wear that around at all or no?
It's funny. I actually go to Wesleyan with one of my friends who was on the team, and we had joked that we'll wear them our first day at school. But no, I think that thing honestly hasn't seen the light of day yet. But it's a pretty cool ring. I like it. Hopefully, I'll have one, or I should be getting one soon. For the NESCAC championship. So that'll be awesome. Hopefully, it'll be good quality. But yeah, I mean, excited about that.
Yeah. So you guys won the NESCAC championship your freshman year.
Yeah, so we actually won this past year. So
wow.
I'm a sophomore this year, and it was this season that we won it. Pretty interesting season where we went 8-1. So the way that the NESCAC does it is it's pretty similar to the Ivy League, where you'll play all the teams in the league in a round robin schedule, and whatever team has the best record at the end of it is the champion. So a lot of times there'll be co-champions where 2 teams are 8-1 or 7-2. But this year was pretty interesting where, again, we were 8-1, and actually heading into the last week of the season, both us and one of our rivals, Trinity, were both 7-1. So it was actually an outright NESCAC championship game, which is pretty rare in both the Ivy League and the NESCAC, where the championship will actually be decided by the last game of the season. And we were able to beat them 27-17, which was pretty sweet for us. And it was actually our first outright championship in program history.
And did you see the field much your freshman year or this past year?
Yeah, so freshman year was definitely an interesting experience where I had just recently finished my treatment and definitely, as I mentioned, had lost a ton of the muscle that I had built. So for me, it was definitely a big challenge to get that back and to be in the best playing shape I could be in. So going into freshman year, I knew that I wasn't going to make the biggest impact on the field on Saturdays. But what I tried to keep in mind is that if I practice every day and just continue to get better and also be a positive impact on the team, whether that's in practice or just in terms of my attitude, then that will lead me to be able to have some more success on the field and help us have success as a team. So freshman year, we went 6-3. We had a solid season, but not in line with our goals as far as winning the NESCAC. And then this past year, my sophomore year, having had that experience and having frankly gotten better every day and keeping that as my focus, was able to contribute to the team on the field on special teams. I was on every special teams as well. And the team had a lot more success, and we won the NESCAC.
You mentioned that you lost a lot of muscle mass throughout the course of your treatment. Prior to your treatment in high school, were you lifting a ton of weights and really trying to put on muscle to prepare to potentially play at the next level?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it was definitely a big challenge for me where, as you mentioned, in high school, that was definitely key to my success, as it would be for any football player. And felt like I had a really strong foundation in the weight room, especially with the postgraduate year. So I think that would have given me a leg up, but then went from that perspective to obviously losing it all. And I think, again, that was definitely challenging, but just taking the mindset of every day in the weight room, I'll work my hardest and continue to get better, I think was important to keep in mind. And I think to this day, I probably don't have quite the muscular strength that I had previously, but it's definitely coming back. And I think I've done a good job of really just controlling what I can control. And I think that's all you really can do in the situation.
Do you have any sort of idea of the weight you were at prior, in that PG year at Proctor, heading into the lacrosse season, and then when you finished your treatment?
Yeah, sure. There's definitely a couple data points that I can point to. So when I was a post-grad at Proctor in the football program, I weighed around 200 pounds, and I think that was pretty lean muscle, and I ran around a 4.6 40. So definitely felt fast and strong at the time. And then going into my treatment, I think at various points, I think it's pretty interesting because my treatment is pretty unconventional in the sense that I received around 6 months of chemotherapy and then had to pivot my treatment a little bit. So after that 6 months of chemotherapy, I found myself in more of a skinny fat kind of 160 pounds phase where athletics were definitely beyond comprehension at that point. And then at my lowest during my stem cell transplant, actually, I weighed in at around 145 pounds, so felt like skin and bones for me. And then was able to have that experience and then build back from there beyond that. And I think I started my freshman year at around 185 pounds. So been around there for the rest of, for most of my time here at Wesleyan.
Definitely a lot of fluctuation in weight. And would you say you feel pretty strong today and that you're, when you step on that football field, you're ready to hit somebody with a head of steam?
Yeah, for sure. I think on the field, a lot of those worries definitely go away. I think in the weight room, the numbers haven't returned to quite what they were before. But honestly, something that I've kept in mind throughout is just how fortunate I am to actually be on the field and competing. And I think keeping that in mind, where when I'm on the field, I'm not really thinking about how things used to be, and kind of just going out there and competing with the people that I'm going against has been huge for me. And it's easy to look at the weight room numbers and say, well, this is holding me back. But I think I've tried to keep in mind that the focus can always be on the field, and there's always things that you can do to help the team.
That's an incredible mindset, and I commend you for that. I know for me, I was an extremely serious tennis player growing up, and then around age 12 decided to stop playing tennis and play basketball. It was a little bit more of a, I'd say, community-centric sport. You're not out there alone all day. And I really found a lot of love for the game of basketball. And then when I came back to tennis in high school, I was still really good because I was a very serious tennis player as a young kid. But I remember thinking, wow, I feel like I was better at 12 years old than I am now at 16 or 17. And honestly, for me at least, there was a lot of difficulty mentally to get over the fact that I felt more skilled as a 12-year-old than I did when I was 16, 17, 18 in high school.
Right.
And obviously those stories aren't, one-for-one comparisons, but I think there is a microcosm of that feeling of you can't necessarily compare yourself to maybe what you once were,
right.
If you're not kind of, or you weren't able to continue on that path.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to keep in mind, and really all you can do is focus on the present moment and try to contribute to the team from there.
And you mentioned something previously about how you started with about 6 months of chemo and then you ultimately pivoted your treatment to, I believe you said, stem cells. Could you maybe speak a little bit more to why originally you pursued the chemotherapy, and then what made you ultimately pivot your treatment, which ultimately led to the successful outcome?
Yeah, sure. So when I was diagnosed, the particular diagnosis of leukemia and the type that I had has a pretty conventional course of treatment where there have been a lot of studies on the matter done that can inform the way that you should approach your initial treatment. And for me, that took the form of what they call induction and consolidation chemotherapy. So that entails 3 months of induction chemotherapy and 3 months of consolidation chemotherapy, so 6 months in total. And when you say chemotherapy, I think people definitely have their own understanding of what that means. But for me, what it really is just a bunch of drugs that go into your body and mess things up, right? So I think that's pretty much what it is for me. And then the end goal being that while it can have harmful impacts on the positive cells in your body, it'll destroy the cancer cells. So for me, definitely an interesting experience where I didn't respond quite as favorably to that treatment as one would have hoped, and not enough of the cancer was being killed at the time. And as a result, I had to pivot the course of my treatment. So from there, I ended up going to Memorial Sloan Kettering, which has been really life-changing for me, and received a different type of treatment called CAR T-cell therapy, which is an immunotherapy, and it's a pretty interesting science and one that's relatively new. The drug was actually FDA approved in 2017. And what it does is it actually takes the T cells out of your blood. And T cells are a type of white blood cell that are programmed to destroy foreign antigens in your blood. And what it does is it reprograms those T cells to go back into your blood and actually find the cancer cells and kill them, which I think is pretty unique in the sense that I was able to receive that. And it's definitely a lot different from chemo in the sense that chemo involves receiving these really toxic treatments, whereas the CAR T-cell therapy, they actually draw the T cells out of your blood and then pretty much reinfuse them in a pretty standard treatment. So it's actually not super intensive in terms of the actual treatment that you're receiving. And then from there, those reprogrammed T cells go into your blood and actually kill the cancer cells, which I think is pretty unique and definitely really fortunate to have been able to receive that. And then for me, I think that was really effective. And it was interesting because it provided this time in my treatment where I was receiving a more non-toxic type of therapy. So it allowed me to go from having received 6 months of chemo and being in that skinny fat stage like I told you about, and having a non-toxic treatment where I could actually start to feel better. And I started to lift a little bit more and run a little bit more than I would have been able to during chemo, and was actually able to build back a fair amount of my muscle. But then from there, didn't respond as favorably as we quite would have hoped in terms of the CAR T cell. And I think it was really effective, but ultimately it was in my best interest to get a stem cell transplant. So that's a pretty involved procedure where you're actually in the hospital for about a month or at least. And then from there, you'll receive that treatment. And then what that actually involves is you essentially receive a new immune system. So all of my blood currently is actually donor blood. So what they do is they wipe out your existing immune system, and then they'll infuse what they call stem cells from someone else, and that actually becomes your new immune system. So really pretty crazy science all around, and not sure if it's that easy to follow, but definitely really fortunate to have been able to go through that and have a lot of uncertainty throughout the process, but to be on the other end of it now with a full remission.
I certainly don't know the science to break all that down, but I thought you did a wonderful job explaining it. And really one thing that came into my mind in trying to put myself in your shoes throughout this process is, how did you feel as someone who, was a student athlete in college, probably very focused on academics and athletics, and then suddenly, instead of maybe going straight into Wesleyan from your PG year, now you're receiving all this treatment. You're probably learning a lot more as well about the treatments you're receiving. How did that also feel about, I'm not sure what the normal prognosis is somebody in terms of someone of also your demographic. You're young, you're an athlete, so you're in good shape. And receiving the chemotherapy, was it very promising when you started the chemotherapy that might work? And then if it was, how did it maybe feel when you had to then pivot to the CAR T cell therapy and ultimately get the stem cells as well?
Yeah, for sure. I would definitely say it was a bit of a roller coaster ride, and it's funny because when I tell the story to people and they ask me about when I initially heard the news, they ask for my reaction, and it's not quite what you would think it would be, in the sense that I actually was playing lacrosse at the time, and I remember it was the winter of my post-grad year when I started having these weird symptoms, whether it was bone pains that were keeping me up at night and headaches and just a lot of fatigue as well. And I didn't know what was causing it. So I would go get my blood work done or see doctors here and there. And they would say, oh, well, your blood work came back and it looks like you're a little anemic, which means that you have lower red blood cells. So you should try to eat some red meat and do those kind of conventional strategies. And at that point, I didn't know quite what I was working with. And I think for me, there was a point at which it flipped from having those symptoms and thinking it was something that would pass to being in a position where I knew something was seriously wrong. And meanwhile, throughout that whole experience, I was trying to play lacrosse and be a player for our team that could be counted on. And it's interesting, a lot of our teammates had struggled with injuries that year, just poor injury luck. We had a few ACLs on the team. And meanwhile, I'm out there really fatigued and got to a point where I would scoop up a ground ball and run 20 yards and be totally gassed, which doesn't make sense given a normal lacrosse background. So I think it got to a point where I knew something was seriously wrong. And then from there, when I was actually diagnosed, it almost felt like a relief in the sense that I knew I couldn't continue my athletic career in the way that I had. So I felt relieved in the sense that even if it took a long road, I would eventually have the ability to come back from feeling like that. And I think that, that initial relief may have quickly faded in the sense that, the nature of your treatment gets to a point where it presents a lot of different challenges. And then you become more worried about things like how your actual health is going to play out. But I think it did help me in the sense that when I was initially diagnosed, I think my longer term goal was how was I going to get back on the field. And I think having that external goal that was aside from my pure health actually helped me throughout the process.
What I heard from you there is that the unknown was almost more scary at that point, because as you mentioned, running 20 yards and feeling absolutely drained and gassed was probably an extremely foreign feeling. And I would imagine that you would probably try to combat that with maybe more cardio, more effort, and then having that probably even lead to feeling more exhausted and more maybe lethargic in doing things that you could previously done. Maybe getting an explanation of why that was potentially a relief. And when you were diagnosed, was the prognosis very good in terms of the chemotherapy working, or was that also something that, may or may not have?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I was initially diagnosed, I think the prognosis was pretty positive. You mentioned the point where for someone in my health and my age, I think it made sense that I had a pretty good chance to have a positive outcome. So I think there was around a 90% chance that I was going to survive at that point. And the most standard route was going to be that 6 months of chemotherapy. Or I guess if I had gone through that 6 months of chemotherapy, I would have had a few more months of what they call maintenance chemo. And for me, I thought that would be the standard route for me. But then in the situation where I didn't respond as favorably to that chemotherapy, that's actually pretty rare. So I'd say around 5% or less of people who have the diagnosis and who go through that regimen don't respond favorably to it. So I was definitely put in a unique position where doubt can creep in and you don't know what the next step of the treatment is going to be. And then from there, I think that was when I started to take more of a lens of, okay, this could be really serious for my health, and began to really prioritize the things like understanding the treatments that I was going through and understanding what the best next step would be.
So when you switched from receiving the chemotherapy, then the CAR T-cell therapy, were you very optimistic at that point? Or you mentioned that only 5% of people that go through that treatment plan of chemotherapy don't respond favorably to the treatment. So what was your mentality like at that point? And were you almost, as you mentioned, it seemed like the CAR T-cell therapy went extremely well for you and you really started to feel a lot better. Was there any sort of sense of relief that, hey, I might be stopping this chemo even though it didn't work and could potentially have a better outcome with this new treatment?
Yeah, definitely. I think you hit all the key points there. I think at first when I had done the 6 months of chemo and gotten my results back from that, and I hadn't responded favorably, I was pretty worried about what the next step would be. And in fact, I didn't know what it would be. There was no really default option at that point. So I think I was definitely worried and stressed from that. But then once I had the options laid out in front of me, I think it was pretty clear what the proper choice would be, in the sense that I would go the CAR T cell route, which could potentially be non-toxic, and get that treatment and see how it goes. And I think, to your point, really, it couldn't have gone a whole lot better. I think there was an interesting part of the treatment where I received the therapy, which again was non-toxic, and for about 2 or 3 months, I had pretty consistent results in terms of feeling better, right? So leukemia is a blood cancer, and when you have it, your red blood cells are lower, which means that you're going to be really fatigued. So all of a sudden, it felt like I felt a lot better, and I could do a lot more. All of a sudden, I had always ran and lifted to the extent that I could during my treatment, and a lot of times that would result in just basic push-ups or even walking at certain times. But suddenly, I was in a position where I could lift not the weight that I could previously, but pretty close to it, and I could sprint almost as fast as I could previously. And I remember I actually timed my 40-yard dash during that treatment, and it was pretty close to what I had previously run. It was around 4.7. So was pretty amazed with how things had turned out with that, and definitely felt really fortunate. And definitely at that point, I think it crossed my mind that I could actually end up benefiting from this. And then I think that definitely changed in the sense that I was actually tasked with the decision of determining whether I would want to stick with the CAR T cell therapy and pretty much just ride it out, because what that therapy involves is just the infusion of the CAR T cells, and then that's it. There's no other therapy. So what I could have done is discontinued my treatment basically and continued to monitor things. But I think with the very, very limited amount of cancer that was still in my blood, where it was actually a level that was so small it was unquantifiable, but you could use DNA sequencing to actually determine that it was there, it was in my best interest to go to the stem cell transplant route. And definitely a difficult decision, because I knew that was a much more involved process where, again, I would be in the hospital for at least a month and have another medical setback athletically, at least, where I was going to have to regain a lot of my muscle mass. So definitely really a difficult decision for me, but I think having been able to consult my doctor, who was extremely supportive and informative throughout, and also look at the research myself, was pretty interesting experience. And I think looking back on it, I think I definitely made the right decision, and easy to say given the outcome where I'm fully healthy, but I think definitely a really interesting experience where kind of the roller coasters of the experience definitely drove a lot of it. And
after receiving the stem cell transplant and then ultimately gaining your full health back, was there one moment that you'd point to where you felt like, I beat this and I'm back?
It's interesting because the way that you determine if you have leukemia in your blood is called a bone marrow biopsy. So what they'll do is they actually look into your bone marrow to see how many cancer cells are present. And what that'll do is allow you to determine whether or not there are any at all. And then for me, I remember after the transplant, I went the standard month from there, just recovering and pretty much becoming a normal person again after that month in the hospital. And I had my first bone marrow biopsy and was definitely nervous about what the results would be. And it's interesting because there were really two main sources of information we had to determine whether or not I still had cancer cells in my body. And the first one was the standard lab test where they would essentially take your blood and put it under a microscope and actually look for leukemia cells. And for that one, I was really fortunate in that they couldn't see any, right? So from that test, I was cancer-free at the time. But what Memorial Sloan Kettering was able to do, and it's one of the reasons why they're a premier hospital and frankly the one that saved my life, is actually send the testing out to a lab in Seattle. And what they do is called next generation sequencing. So what they do is they actually look at your blood and determine if there are the same DNA sequences in your blood as there were previously when those leukemia cells were identified, and determine if there are any matching DNA strands in the blood to determine if there's actually any leukemia. And what that initial test after the stem cell transplant had determined is that, again, there was that same level of leukemia where there was an unquantifiably small amount, but it was potentially present. So I think that definitely was nerve-wracking for me, but interestingly enough, that was actually somewhat normal for the treatment, in the sense that, again, the bone marrow transplant involves receiving someone else's stem cells, and that becomes your new immune system. And I had also similarly been tested at that point to determine how much of my blood was actually the donor's blood versus mine. And the donor's blood was actually responsible for 97% of my blood. So I knew that there was a chance, and in all likelihood, the donor's blood would become my entire immune system. And at that point, we could have the faith that my new T cells and my new immune system would be able to fight off any existing cancer. But it was really exactly what I described it as, which was faith. I didn't know exactly how things would play out. And I remember about a month later, I had another bone marrow biopsy. And then about 2 weeks after that, was definitely nervously awaiting the results. And I remember getting a call from one of our nurse practitioners, and she had shared the news that the test came back completely negative and couldn't determine any cancer cells, even with the DNA sequencing, which was probably the moment that I realized that I'd beat cancer, so to speak.
That's wonderful. And what did you do thereafter? You call your parents, you go out for a run?
Yeah, I was actually home at the time with my mom, and I remember she started crying. I was maybe a little bit more emotionally contained, but definitely super excited. And I think shortly thereafter, I got together with some of my friends, and we hit a Yankees game, which was pretty fun.
You a Yankees fan?
Yeah, for sure. It's rough sledding around here with the injuries, but.
And so thereafter, what time of the year or what date was it when you received that full cancer-free diagnosis?
Yeah, I want to say that was around mid-March or early April.
Okay, and then maybe 5 or 6 months after that is when you started at Wesleyan, your freshman year.
Yeah, exactly. So I think pretty shortly before receiving that news in March was when I could actually eat and drink normally and pretty much function as a human being, as I mentioned. So it was definitely a quick turnaround as far as knowing that my goal was going to be to play football that year. And I made it my goal to just practice every day. And I think that was definitely uncertain at the time, but pretty much just put my head down and worked for that to become the reality.
And then how's your experience at Wesleyan been thus far? Freshman year, obviously, you were playing football. Were you also involved in any on-campus activities? What did you decide to pursue academically?
Yeah, for sure. So I've really enjoyed my time at Wesleyan. To answer your question about academics, I'm majoring in economics and psychology. So I think one of those was pretty intuitive to me. In high school, I think my favorite class was AP Econ. And that's why I was excited to study economics and have enjoyed that since then. And then in terms of psychology, that's definitely not something I had on my radar, but I remember taking an intro psychology class, frankly, just to have an easier course on my course load, but I actually found the material really interesting, and I've enjoyed studying it since then. And then to your other question about what I'm doing on campus, I'm definitely fortunate to be in a position where I can volunteer to actually help people who are in a similar position to me. So what our football team does every year is they organize what's called a bone marrow drive. And what that entails is swabbing people's cheeks to actually get them in the registry for a potential bone marrow transplant. So for patients like me who are in need of an actual donor for their transplant, the registry will allow the doctors to determine who the proper match is for that person. And then from there, should that person end up being a match and for them to actually go through that process, they will then donate blood, typically peripheral blood, which is what it was for me, or sometimes actual bone marrow, and that's actually pretty much a life-saving treatment for them. So it's definitely nice to have had that going for the Wesleyan football program and then to have been able to contribute to it personally.
And on campus, obviously, you're working out a lot with the football team. Is that a full year commitment, or are you guys only working out maybe 2 of the 3 seasons that you're at school for?
Yeah, I'd say the latter is potentially more accurate. I think with a NESCAC, we have a favorable schedule in the sense that we'll go back for camp a little bit later than some other schools. So we'll have around 2 weeks before the normal students get back of our preseason camp, which is nice. And then after the season, we'll get a little bit of a break from the football team. And then when we get back from school after winter break, we'll be full speed ahead with our off-season program and lifting with the guys and running and doing conditioning with them. And then actually in a couple of weeks here, we'll start our spring practices, which is going to be pretty exciting.
And what does that look like in terms of off-season training? How many days a week are you lifting? How many days are you running? And is all that mandated by the team and you do it on your own, or are you doing that all as a team?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we'll do 4 lifts a week, and then we'll do conditioning twice a week. So what that'll entail is we'll have 2 lifts where we'll have the full team in the weight room at the same time. So we'll split it up, offense and defense. And those are pretty exciting because we get all the guys in there on the squat rack and cheering each other on, which is definitely awesome. And then our other 2 lifts during the week we'll do by position. So I'll be there with the DBs, which is a great group. Definitely love hanging out with those guys. And then in terms of the conditioning, we'll be with our coaches twice a week in the morning, and they'll run us through what other programs we call mat drills or whatever you want to call it, but definitely gets you right and excited for the spring.
And you mentioned you're working out with the DBs. Are you playing cornerback, safety?
Yeah, I'm at safety, so definitely better suited for my skill set. I don't want to be covering any of the guys outside, but it's nice because you get to play in the box a little bit, but also play some recess football out there and cover some guys.
And have you always played safety, or is that a new position for you at Wesleyan?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think for me, in high school, I was playing more of a defensive end, outside linebacker role, so definitely not the most natural transition, but I think it makes sense when you consider that the level of play in high school isn't the same as it would be in college, where it wouldn't exactly be in anyone's best interest to put one of your better athletes back in the secondary when we're thinking about teams that are having trouble completing the ball on air as is. So I think it made more sense to put me in the box and to be closer to the action on defense, and then also played offense in high school as well, but really enjoyed being a safety in college, where I think my skill set is pretty suited for it, where I think I'm fast but also can tackle in the box.
Yeah, you mentioned in terms of the athletic difference between high school and college. In my high school, when I came back to play basketball my senior year, was the center on the team. I was the biggest guy.
Nice.
And in college, the point guard at Yale was my size. Yeah. And it just makes you realize, someone playing center in high school is going to be the size of a point guard in college. It's definitely not an apples to apples comparison. And what are your favorite parts about playing safety?
Yeah, I think it's awesome because, for example, when we get back in the spring, we actually will do exactly pretty much what we're doing on Saturdays, minus the tackling and being in pads. I think we'll do a lot of 7-on-7 work and a lot of what we call skelly, and what that'll allow me to do is really rep out covering our receivers and competing against them in practice, which is pretty nice. Whereas the offensive linemen and the defensive linemen, they'll be out there not wearing any pads and also doing one-on-ones and going against each other, which can get a little chippy and definitely some gray area in terms of who's winning what reps. But for us, it's a little bit more black and white in terms of who's winning, and definitely thankful for that. But then in terms of the actual season, it'll be pretty sweet where you can go out there and really just hit everyone else and not really take a ton of hits yourself. Whereas in high school, playing running back, you're taking a lot of the hits. So I think it's a pretty sweet position where you get the mix of competing against the receivers and then the quarterbacks, but also making some tackles in the box.
And what are you doing over the summer? So you have all this spring football, and then during the summer, I'm sure some people might go and work, some people might try to play football and really train. What have you done to kind of approach maybe getting ready for this season or pursuing other avenues during the summer? And obviously you've only had one summer so far in college, but...
Yeah, sure. So last summer, I think was pretty effective in the sense that I had an internship with Northwell Health, actually, which was one of the places that I received some treatment at, which was pretty unique, and was able to work with them in their finance department and get some more hands-on experience with some corporate finance functions and operationally focused business units. So that internship was nice, but it was also good because it was local to me. So I was able to keep the focus on football a little bit, and in a sense where we have a pretty good group of guys actually that are pretty local to me. So I can play football with them and get some field work in, but also keep the diligence in the weight room going.
And what were maybe some of your bigger takeaways as someone who very intimately interacted with the healthcare system and then going and actually working in it from a finance perspective?
Yeah, it's definitely unique to see it from the other angle. And I'd say that there's a lot of things that you might not expect or understand from the patient's angle. For example, it's a pretty interesting conversation, especially in health services, where the incentives sometimes aren't as closely aligned as you might expect, in the sense that, say your provider says that you should get X, Y, and Z tests done. It may very well be in your best interest, but at the same time, it's also most definitely in their best interest because the provider that they work for will then be compensated by their insurance company for that service. So you have to ask where you might want to draw the line in terms of aligning the incentives, and it's definitely a very interesting system for us, but I think it's been really informative to be able to work with Northwell last summer.
Yeah, you mentioned the alignment of incentives. One thing that I have seen is people will say, as a doctor, you're not paid by your patients, you're paid by the insurance companies. Mm-hmm. So in effect, you're working for the insurance companies, and I'm no expert on the topic, but there certainly is a lot of criticism of the way that medical reimbursement is run. And I actually have been volunteering in the medical and professional affairs department at New York City Health and Hospitals. It's quite interesting. They're the largest municipal hospital system in the country, and they serve over 1 million New Yorkers annually. And one thing that I've realized in my job is that in such a large organization, there's only so much places that you can place your focus, and no one is necessarily acting against the interest of patients, but there's potentially so much that you need to do outside of the patient care aspect that optimizing everything is really a very difficult thing to do and requires a lot of investment. And do you want to be investing in, a 5-year transformation to optimize back-end processes, or do you want to put that investment in for the patients and really try to, maybe not optimize the hospital operationally, but optimize it maybe for the patients? And the research that we actually did was an effort that a physician that I was working with implemented in terms of better triaging patients that are suspected of having malignancies or cancer when they come into either their emergency department or their primary care provider, and how they could operationally, which it sounds pretty simple, but it is a change to do when you're referring patients. There's now a few questions that relate to, do you suspect that this patient might have cancer? And then also confirming that, and then selecting which specialty department to refer them to. And that also enables the person who needs to schedule 100 appointments every day to see, these are my top priority people to schedule. Let's get them in as soon as possible. And just in that effort and recognizing that, hey, we're not triaging these patients fast enough, they've been able to, in only, I think it's like 4 or 5 months, cut down the time to schedule those patients' appointments by 60%. So not only are they getting scheduled within a day or two, but they're actually seeing that specialty provider. Maybe if before it was 3 weeks, 21 days, now it's only maybe 7 or 8 days. Yeah. So just seeing the ways in which you can contribute to the healthcare system, not necessarily by just seeing patients, but by also optimizing the hospital as an organization, has been interesting to me. But then there's also the frictions of properly billing the insurance, actually getting the money from the insurance when you do bill them. And I'm no expert on it again, but as I kind of start to dive into that world, I found it very interesting, the ways that you can contribute not only from a patient care perspective, but from an organizational perspective as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really interesting conversation where you pointed out in the healthcare system, you have both the patient-facing role and all the things that are going on beyond the scenes. So I think it makes sense where something that I've noticed in my treatment is that everyone who works in healthcare has a genuine interest in helping people, which I think is great, but making sure that the incentives are aligned so that you can actually provide the best patient care is definitely a much bigger conversation. And it's great that you were able to do something or be a part of something where you can actually optimize the patient experience, and definitely something I can relate to as given my experience last summer.
Yeah, I was more on the side of analyzing the data, figuring out, not only analyzing it, but then also there's a whole array of data that we had access to. So actually then going into it and validating it, because sometimes the diagnosis was pulled incorrectly, because obviously it's not like one patient only has one diagnosis and so forth. So that was a very big lift, but something that I think I enjoy as an analytical person. You mentioned the alignment of incentives. There's a really lengthy yet rich podcast by Peter Attia, and I'm forgetting his last name, but his guest was actually, I think, a partner at McKinsey named Sam, and they talked about the different actors within the healthcare system, specifically insurance companies, and then I think middlemen that work between the insurance companies and the providers that set the prices of drugs when you're buying them collectively. Yeah. I hope I'm getting this right, but the disalignment of incentives is perhaps what's driving the frustration with the healthcare system that you hear so frequently in the media and for people going through the healthcare system.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because I actually got asked in an interview that was not really at all related to healthcare, what is one issue with the healthcare system and a solution, and put on the spot with it. I don't know if I formulated the best answer, but I did speak to some of the things that we're talking about where incentives aren't always aligned. And I think what's been interesting for me is I've learned a little bit, at least not as much as I would have hoped, but a little bit about a potential solution to that, and it's called value-based care. So what value-based care actually involves is, I think it's best to think of it in terms of a newborn child, right? So what a value-based care provider would be able to do is receive premiums from that family in exchange for all of that child's healthcare. So what that would be able to do is allow that person's healthcare provider to only provide them with the services that are absolutely necessary for their health, but also in the best interest of their health. So really optimize the services with which they're incurring and ultimately what the premiums that they're paying are worth. So suppose that a newborn child is born, and obviously there are a lot of services that are associated with that. What the provider is then going to be incentivized to do is only perform those which are necessary, because any malignancies that arise or special situations or any type of healthcare issues that arise down the line, the value-based care provider will be on the hook for those. So it'll be in their best interest to make sure that they're providing the necessary services, running the necessary screening, providing the best care. But then on the flip side of that, they're not overdoing anything to the point where it wouldn't be in their best financial interest, because the only thing that they're getting in exchange for this are the premiums that are set. And as a result, that can align incentives maybe a little bit better. But I did point out that it's a pretty interesting discussion of how do you actually implement that, right? You can't just snap your fingers and that becomes the reality.
Yeah, and there's a whole host of things that you could point out in that might not necessarily perfectly align the incentives, yet it seems like it could potentially be a better solution than we have today. And I certainly have experienced frustrations, not as much on the receiving care end of things, because with my job at McKinsey, my healthcare then, they give us a pretty great healthcare plan. But just in terms of figuring out where I can go that's covered by my insurance, right. I feel like I'd be on the phone for like an hour with a few different places just trying to figure out, do you take this insurance? What's going to be my copay if there is one? And really just figuring out, am I covered here? Because I feel like there was one situation where I went somewhere that said I would be covered, but then since I had my insurance through work and I was still in my parents' plan because I'm young enough, there was some sort of mix-up where my work insurance didn't want to pay because they knew I had this other insurance, and then right. yada, 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 and then I got stuck with like a $400 or $500 bill. Yeah. And I was like, that just, with two insurance plans, shouldn't be providing for something that's pretty routine. So there's definitely frustrations across every end of the spectrum, but hopefully incrementally the system improves and gets better and better aligned to the incentives where it really is just centered around, for each individual patient, how can we best cater our care to that patient?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is. It's certainly a unique conversation, and we'll see we'll see how things play out in the near future.
And you mentioned you were first asked that question during an interview. So was that an interview for a potential job this summer? Are you going back to Northwell Health? What do you maybe find yourself doing for this upcoming summer, and then maybe your junior year summer as well? Because I know that's like the big summer for college recruiting.
Yeah, sure. So interestingly enough, you hit on both the points there. I actually may return to Northwell Health in more of an expanded role this summer, which I'm excited about. But I actually happened to field that question in a pretty unrelated, you would think, interview, and it was for an investment banking role. And I think it was definitely tailored towards my interest, where I had the experience in healthcare and also my personal experience. So I think it made sense from that perspective. But yeah, I'd say the investment banking recruiting process is definitely an interesting one. And obviously that junior summer, you insightfully point out is the big summer, right, where they're going to want to hire those candidates. So definitely glad to have that in the rear view in one sense.
So that means you actually went through that process and now you have an offer with an investment bank?
Yeah, so it's interesting because especially talking to older people who went through the process earlier, they're always pointing out that it seems to accelerate faster and faster every year, which is definitely true. And I'm really fortunate to the point where I guess I'm still in my sophomore year here and have secured the junior summer internship. So definitely really fortunate with how that played out.
Yeah, and I'll say, reflecting on my own experience, I was very fortunate. I recruited for McKinsey almost 3 weeks after I had gotten back to campus in my junior year. And I had been preparing for a long time before that and networking and so forth, but got the offer after, I had one super day and that was it after I sent in my resume. I thankfully just randomly had networked with people that were involved in the DC office recruiting scene or the DC office recruiting team. And then after that was selected for a super day where I had 4 1-hour interviews back to back to back to back. Blew it out of the park there, was really happy with how I did, and then got the offer on my way back to school that day. And now when I reflect on it, it was such a relief once I got that offer and had it in the books. But then after coming back full time, I started a little bit later than 2 years after I had received that offer.
Right.
And then I realized, oh my God, I think one shortcoming of me going into that process is towards the end of my senior year, when they actually delayed my start date, I think there was a little bit of an opening of, hey, if you don't want to come back, you could say, hey, I don't want to, I want to leave this offer on the table because you delayed my start date by 5 or 6 months. And I think they were almost, I'd say, very open to the idea of people not coming back because I think they realized they'd over-recruited. And I think I made the right decision to ultimately stick with my offer. In my mind, I had signed the contract. I said I was going back. That's what I should have done, and that's what I did do. But I think given the fact that it seems like they would have been receptive to somebody saying, hey, I actually might want to pursue something else, I think it could have been useful for me to at least look at myself and say, hey, in the year and 8 months since I actually signed this offer and then thereafter had my internship, am I actually still wanting to pursue this? Because choosing to start something, kind of like you said, in the latter half of your sophomore year, and then the internship, you definitely do get a taste for it. But then coming back full time, it's almost 2 years beyond when you made that decision.
Right.
A lot of things do change in that time.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely an interesting case study where you went and ended up choosing to go in a different route. But I think it's easy to look back at the decision and say that all the cards were there for you to say that you didn't want to do it initially. Mm-hmm. But I think you really only know that if you try, in a sense. So I think while it may seem like you can go back and could have made a different decision, I think ultimately the experience is still valuable in the sense that at that point you definitely knew for sure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I think if I were to have told myself to go back, and now knowing that I want to pursue medicine, if I told myself then pursue medicine, I actually think I would have forever thought, oh, what if I did pursue McKinsey, the business world? And undoubtedly, I'm actually thankful I did do it because now I have even more conviction heading into the world of medicine. And then what this current experience has showed me working in the corporate office of this hospital is that my McKinsey experience is actually so valuable and will really help me. And so it's almost like I wish I could have gone back and maybe done a little bit more diligence and, maybe I could have done like more healthcare oriented consulting. Mm-hmm. I ultimately did do a lot of that work at McKinsey, But maybe if I went into the firm with that direction, I wouldn't have maybe done some projects in other areas that were very insightful in terms of helping me realize I don't want to pursue those areas, and instead could have gained a little bit more insight into one more perspective within the healthcare system.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That was actually what I was going to ask you, if you think that there's overlap in terms of what you did. But I think I can imagine a couple of ways in which consulting would be somewhat comparable or useful, at least for your current pursuits. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Really, and I think one thing that has really been striking to me in my current role is in the data that we're analyzing data from, I think it's 12 hospitals. And when all those hospitals were brought together under the same, I'll say, data umbrella, where that's all being housed centrally, each one had their own data collection processes. So it wasn't like for a patient that was being seen at hospital A and hospital C, you're going to have the exact same data under the exact same fields, and then rolling that up and then trying to analyze it is a bit difficult. And then thinking, oh, let's just change it to all be the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's not like you snap your fingers and 12 hospitals all of a sudden change all their systems and so forth. So I think in that there is actually kind of a role in the consulting domain to help hospitals do that. And I think there definitely are consulting agencies that do that. What I would say though is, after working for McKinsey for a year and a half, I have some insight into this, but I think a partner at the firm could give you 10x the insight that I could. But one thing that I came to realize is that there's some projects that we'll be hired for where I feel like the problem we're solving and what the client is coming to us with is something that is a very difficult problem that in solving it creates a ton of value, and we're able to do it so quickly, often at the detriment of, the analysts and the associates and the mid-level managers. But, we really do, or would at the firm, work so tirelessly and create so much value for clients in those situations where they might be paying us, let's say $100, and we'll create $500 worth of value. And so that company and bringing on McKinsey really got a lot out of that. But then there's that common gripe or criticism that people might have in the consulting industry where people are using it to outsource a tough decision to a consulting firm so that they can say, I didn't make that decision, but McKinsey did if it does blow up. And I think that, that probably has happened. I don't ever think that really was one of the projects that I was on. But sometimes I feel like if the goal for the project isn't as pointed or it's super open-ended, we can lay out all these options for our client and really do diligence on each one and what it might look like. But it's a little bit harder to, I'd say, quantify the value of those efforts. And then sometimes, and thankfully this actually didn't happen to one project I was on, which I found out a year after the fact, but you'll do all this work, you maybe will lay out all these options or potential avenues your client could pursue in kind of achieving this goal they wanted to. And in the context of this study I'm referencing, it was a sales growth and marketing project for a very large consumer packaged goods company, and they were thinking about some, I'd say, marketing efforts that they could do kind of in a new means of marketing that has kind of arisen more recently and some other brands had found success in. And so we put together very quickly a ton of case studies, what other brands were doing. We conducted expert interviews to figure out how they did it. But in laying out all those options, if they just kind of shelved that work and didn't actually use it to inform their path forward, it wouldn't have been worth it. They would have paid, let's say again, $100, and maybe the insights that they would have gotten from all our presentations and stuff would have given them $50 worth of value. And if they followed it to a T, maybe it would have given them $200, $300 worth of value. But ultimately, if the work isn't used, you're not going to get any value from that, which is also frustrating as a consultant because you finish that project, the next week you're starting something new, and you might have no idea where that 3 months of 9 to midnight work went.
Right.
But actually, a year after the fact, I was meeting with one of my managers for that project, and he said, I followed up with our client, and they said they're actually beginning to roll it out, and that
nice.
Our work really did help them in thinking about how they wanted to pursue that. And that was just oh my God, that feels great. That, that was 3-4 months of work that I didn't just kind of land in somebody's drawer and were forgotten about. But yeah, I feel like you see at least that. I feel like that what that will help me realize maybe down the line in my career, if I am in a position, in a administrative position within a hospital system, maybe better recognizing what problems can we solve in-house and, not necessarily get the most bang from our buck from an outside agency or consulting agency, and what problems are we not suited to solve and would actually be better solved by an outside party who has done this time and time again. Because I think one thing that consulting firms actually really do benefit from is if they've done something 10 different times for 10 different clients, then if you have no experience with it as a company and you can bring in people who have done this 10 times and know exactly what they're doing, then it's actually better to bring in that outside party. I think that's exactly what investment banks do in terms of helping companies prepare for a sale and come to a reasonable price to sell or when there is a merger.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because a lot of the things that you're talking about, I think, were ideas that I talked about a little bit in interviews and things that I picked up from my psychology major. And one of them, for example, is this idea of functional fixedness, where it's the old adage where to the man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So if you're working in medicine, say, or at X, Y, and Z company, and they're approaching a certain problem and they only have a certain skill set with which they can apply to it, it can be in their best interest to outsource that problem. And being able to have that as one of the things where you can take your consulting experience and actually apply it to what you'll be doing in medicine, I think will be really helpful for you. And then to incorporate some other lessons of psychology that I think you touched on, some of them are really this idea of both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, where I think you have to really challenge yourself in a lot of these roles in finance, consulting, or even medicine to be intrinsically motivated in what you're doing, where the work that you're doing is actually somewhat rewarding in itself, regardless of the outcome that it leads to. And I think that's relevant in investment banking, where you may be working on a pitch or a deal for a long time and not see the deal actually go through, or you might be staffed on an account for a long time and pitch plenty of pitch books and not actually end up seeing anything come to light. But what you have to keep in mind is that the work that you're doing is still rewarding to the team in a sense. And then those moments where you do get that extrinsic reward of the client actually using your idea is something that you should definitely appreciate. And I think it speaks to the process-oriented mentality that has definitely helped me in a lot of the adversity that I went through with the cancer treatment, but also just in general, trying to keep that in mind, I think is important.
And we've had a very robust conversation today. We've dipped in and out of a number of subjects, but kind of as we come to a close here, is there anything that you would maybe say to anybody listening to this, whether or not they're going through a similar process that you've gone through or just struggling with anything in life? What is kind of your big takeaway from your experience thus far, and what would you maybe want someone to take away from your story here today?
Yeah, definitely. I think really all you can do is all you can do, if that makes sense. I mean, there's going to be situations where you're tasked with extremely challenging circumstances, and it's in your best interest to give everything your best effort, and that'll guarantee you the best chance of success. And I think, as our head coach is always pointing out, you can do everything right and that guarantees you nothing. But if you guarantee that effort at least, then you're going to be in a good position. And I think for someone who's in my position as well, just understand that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that the work that you're putting in the day-to-day, I think, will be rewarding at the end of the day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Stroll. If you like this episode and would like to be in the loop for future episodes while also supporting the podcast, please subscribe to the podcast here and follow the podcast on social media for updates. Our Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube are thestroll_podcast, and our X account is thestroll_pod. I'd like to give another big thank you to Evan for coming on the podcast and for being so open and willing to speak about his challenges in beating leukemia. I'm really impressed by Evan and his story and hope that you found the insights and takeaways from our conversation to be useful, informative, and equally inspirational. As always, thank you for listening. Much love, one love.